The ayes have it, is a division called for. Ring the bells.
It's dawn again. So this is the second all-night sitting, but we're now a third of the way through. We will get through this. The vote is resoundingly in our favour, but they haven't conceded yet. Still another day to go, I think.
People of my generation benchmark what they were doing on the day that John F. Kay died. From this generation onwards, people will remember this day for a different reason, and that's the reason that this chamber, this parliament, has accepted this important legislative reform.
We've just passed the Voluntary Assisted Dying bill in the upper house. It's been a 27, 30-hour debate, so we haven't had much sleep. It's been 61 hours all up, but we passed it. We passed it. But we did this for Peter Shaw. It was the thing I said the day I was elected, that I would try and do this as the first thing I did when I got elected.
Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Hello, Facebook. Really delighted today to be joining you from Wurundjeri country in the Kulin Nation. But welcome, and I welcome any Aboriginal elders or Aboriginal people who are watching today from wherever you are. And I don't quite know where our guest is, but he's on my screen, slightly to the left of me, which I never really thought would be the case. But I'm really delighted to welcome Andrew Denton from Go Gentle and every other memory that you have of him from all sorts of television and other, hilarious things that Andrew does and really serious things that he does. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Fiona, and I hope people's memories aren't too specific or too brutal.
No, some things are seared in our heads, but I'm sure those are only the good ones. Andrew, tomorrow marks the 4-year anniversary of the Victorian Voluntary Assisted Dying laws being passed, and I'm sure much of that debate is seared into your mind and certainly into mine. But if someone had said on that day that we would see 4 states in 4 years pass assisted dying, would you have taken that bet?
No, I wouldn't. I did know, as all of us involved in Victoria's debate knew, that the reason that was such a pitched and intense battle over such a long period of time is that everybody on both sides knew it was the watershed moment, because the existence of a VAD law would, as it has, disprove all those fear-based arguments about all the terrible things about doctors encouraging elderly people to die, about palliative care collapsing, would just disprove them. And so I think the existence of Victoria's law, even though we couldn't see it 4 years ago, has made those other laws possible, because parliamentarians who didn't know how to argue against hypotheticals now have actual facts and actual experience that they can point to.
Yeah, no, that's right. And you've obviously been part of all of the debates, and it has it become easier?
It depends on the state. Western Australia, which was the second, was still a very difficult battle. A couple of things I've noticed have changed, and I think they're really good things. One is in Victoria in 2017 and in the debates before that, the argument that palliative care has all the answers was very persuasive to a lot of MPs.
Yeah.
It's not as persuasive now, not because people don't think palliative care is good at what they do, but they accept the evidence now, perhaps in a way they didn't, that there are limitations to palliative care.
Yeah.
And also, let's not forget, it's not mandatory. The other one, which held a lot more sway in 2017, which really doesn't seem to cut it now, is this idea that this is encouraging or is some form of suicide. There is a much, there are still people push that, but there is a much broader and deeper understanding that this is quite different to suicide. This is a choice between deaths. The metaphor I give, and it's a true story, is 9/11, when we remember those people jumping from the buildings because the building was melting beneath them. And the chief medical examiner of New York did not classify those deaths as suicides. He classified them as homicides because they were forced into a terrible decision. That's the same for VAD. So that's changed. It's still frustrating and depressing to see many of the same arguments run nonetheless. And I still find it deeply shocking to see doctors who must and should know better suggesting that these problems can be dealt with in other ways, or that they can be, that there need be no suffering at the end of life. And it's just such a willful act of ignorance to argue that. And I assume it must be willful, because I find it hard to think that any doctor of any experience doesn't know the truth of these stories.
That's right. Do you think with those doctors that are still in opposition, and I'm assuming that the AMA, the Australian Medical Association, hasn't changed their position, is this, to me, when I was talking to doctors back in 2016, 17, it seemed to me it was about control, that it was about them still controlling and having that control and doing what's best for the patient, not necessarily the patient having that decision making in those decisions or those times.
I think that's right. I describe it as Doctor for God and Doctor as God, and sometimes they can be parallel or the same thing. Yeah. There are a lot of doctors, what I describe as this crucifix behind the stethoscope, who are arguing apparently to MPs from a medical view, but they're strongly connected to religious views. And the most, what I've discovered, almost without exception, the most committed medical warriors against VAD are also very committed warriors for the church, often for the Catholic Church.
Right.
But yes, control and paternalism, the idea of Doctor as God, the old doctor knows best, that is still a big thing in medicine. And I think, one of the people I interviewed recently is a wonderful woman called Molly Carlisle, who you probably know,
yes,
very senior palliative care figure in Australia, going back to its earliest days, and raised a Catholic, strongly Catholic. I think she's got nuns and priests scattered all through her family. And she was, like many in palliative care, which has strong Christian roots, strongly opposed and publicly opposed to VAD. And she's changed over recent years, and she told me something very interesting. She said, I started to talk to people and listen to people more carefully, and I thought, we're being hypocritical here. How can we say that we're about patient-centered care and we support all your choices, except for this one that we don't agree with? And so I think what's become very clear to me in the years I've been doing this and the hundreds of interviews I've conducted with families and patients and doctors is that there is an immense sense of disempowerment when you go into an institution at the end of life. And it's not that the institution's trying to be cruel or anything like that, but they have their systems, they have their way of acting. And Brian Aller, who helped frame Victoria's law, the former president of the federal AMA, he told me that when his dad was dying, he and his sister felt disempowered in the hospital. And this is the former president of the AMA. So it's, because you're going through this deeply traumatic experience anyway, and it is all new, so you don't really know what's going to happen. And so as it unfolds, it's shocking. To be in a system where the doctor insists that they'll do it their way, and where you discover, as a woman, fabulous woman I spoke to in Western Australia told me, Jan Kelly, who described the death of her husband, and it was a terrible 2 weeks of suffering, which he should never have gone through. And she said, you know, you can be given the best palliative care, you can be told you're going to be given the best palliative care, but and you can screen the place down if you like, but if they say you've had enough pain relief, then that's it, there's nothing you can do.
Yeah.
So it is very much about power.
Yeah.
And it's you know, in some ways too, Fiona, I see this as the last fight of the dark ages. You know, some of the values that we're talking about here, the values that still guide doctors' judgment about the amount of pain relief they give, were actually written back in the 13th century. You know, it's called the doctrine of double effect, and it basically says that it's up to a doctor's intention. It's about what a doctor intends. They can give you lots of pain relief as long as they don't intend to end your life. So it all comes back to what the doctor thinks. It's never about what does the patient actually request or what they want or what they might need. It's what does the doctor think and how do they feel? And if you're a strongly religious doctor who believes in a natural death, and that perhaps even that there is redemptive value to be had in suffering, which is a value held by some, then you might have a completely different view about the amount of pain relief someone who's suffering should be given to another doctor who doesn't have those views and thinks, I'm just going to hit you with everything because you clearly need it.
Do you think, and I think it's really interesting hearing even people like Brian Owl feeling that disempowered. Is it also that we have lacked the tools to have these conversations prior to to being in the hospital in these circumstances? So we're also relying on the doctor to make decisions because we haven't had those conversations. We're not completely clear about the direction that we would prefer, or that we know that the person, our loved one, would want.
Yeah, and I think that's still the case. And you know, I'll give myself as Exhibit A. I've been down the death mines now for some years. I still haven't done an advanced care directive. Why? Well, I'm not going to die. Are you going to die, Fiona? You're not going to die.
Yeah.
Well, you will, but I won't. It is hard for us to grapple with it. And but in the same way as I guess we take out insurance, which is it's a fairly boring procedure to go through, but you do it because you realize it's smarter to do it than not to do it. You know, Rodney Syme, who is one of the great forces behind the existence of Victoria's law and this law more generally.
Yes.
He's a very senior doctor, and he's really strong on this. And I think it's worth remembering, he said, yes, parliaments have their role and doctors have their role, but each of us individually have to take responsibility for our care. And it is better for us if we learn more about the system we're going to go into and prepare for that.
Yeah.
And, you know, if when the time comes, we'd rather be at home, we don't want to be wired up to the machines that go bing, well, we have to plan for that.
That's right.
Because, you know, most people don't go like in the movies. Sometimes it can be sudden, sometimes it can be catastrophic, sometimes it can be slow and grinding. But as we all know, you know, that old thing, if you don't have anything if you don't have your health. Once illness strikes, it becomes a lot harder to make meaningful actions and decisions.
And I think just quickly following from that, we always thought that in actual fact, having the assisted dying laws there wasn't so much for people, well, that all people would use it, but having it there gave people that comfort that if they wanted to, or if it got to a point that they felt that it was unbearable, that they'd have that tool and that backup, but also that it was about enabling a better conversation.
Oh, absolutely. And a very smart friend said to me when I first started working on this, these laws are permissive. And by that she meant they permit a conversation. Prior to these laws, and you well remember because you sat in that room when the coroner gave his evidence, but prior to these laws, if you were really distressed and terminally ill and there was no good medical path for you, there was no meaningful conversation you could have with a doctor. So when you go to a doctor and say to them, I feel so unwell or so scared of the path ahead that I would like assistance to die, not only legally, but medically, ethically, morally, and personally, that triggers a whole set of questions. Fiona, what is happening? What kind of treatment are you getting? Are there other ways we can help you? It permits a conversation which, you know, I have read and you have read too many accounts of those desperate, horrible and brutal suicides, which wasn't possible before. And it permits it not just for the people who are suffering, but for doctors themselves. I've always felt, and nurses, I've also felt great sympathy for those medical professionals who couldn't help.
I know.
They could do what they could, but they were all scared of, rightly so, of being put on trial.
And I think that was some of the really memorable and compelling witnesses that we heard were palliative care nurses.
Yeah.
And, you know, having, you know, patients pleading with them and them being prevented from doing what they knew that patient wanted and needed, or from being able to help them.
Yeah, and you know, the argument is often made that these laws encourage people to die. But I was fascinated. I've recently made a podcast series, and I spent 11 months talking to people all through the Victorian system, and every doctor I spoke to had said no to requests as well as yes. It's not as simple as that, and there was 2 instances where 2 people had gone all the way through the process, and the pharmacists came to deliver the medication, and the pharmacist said no because that person was no longer competent. So there's so many gates and so many places where the conversation is opened up, as opposed to what it was before, which was limited and in secret, and sometimes not at all.
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting segue to this notion of coercion. And I think, you know, certainly when you were launching your second podcast in Melbourne, there was a doctor who was talking about that the coercion is actually more to try and prevent that it's relatives and loved ones saying, please don't let them do this.
Absolutely, and that's what doctors see. That's what Betty King, who heads the review board, has seen. I was told of one man who took the medication on his own, and he had a good family relationship, but he gave us his reason: I don't want their love holding me back. Yeah. Which is pretty wow, you know. Yeah, look, there, you know, all the arguments were about invisible coercion, and people would be coerced to die, and that's a reasonable question to ask. But what is very clear is this is a difficult law to get through, and in fact there is another safeguard which isn't written in the law and was never debated in Parliament, but it's very real, which is it takes not just determination, but real courage to do this, real courage. And everyone I spoke to, the families, are like, I cannot believe. One woman told me, till the day I die, that'll be the most courageous thing I've ever seen, watching her father do that. But what has become very clear is the coercion is almost all the other way, not just families, though that's very strong. But also there's, and Betty King referred to this as the known unknowns. We don't know how many, we hear it anecdotally, but it's not our job on the review board to collect this information. But we hear plenty anecdotally about doctors saying, oh, that's not for you, or you don't need that, or, yes, I'll help you with that. But 3 weeks later, they say, no, I changed my mind. And I've heard of some far more serious attempts at coercion, people actually harassed in their homes and harassed about their decisions. So I think it's going to be, I think it's a lack in all the laws in Australia, to be honest, something which wasn't discussed because perhaps we didn't realise there was a need. I think there needs to be some kind of ombudsman's complaint process whereby when people are harassed or blocked or dissuaded, that they can report that, because it's a legal choice and it's not one that people come to lightly. And going back to that idea of power, doctors shouldn't be using their position of power. You know, of course they have a right to conscientiously object, but they shouldn't be using that position of power to make it harder for people to do something that's already very hard.
And we have to apparently we have to stop talking soon. But how, you know, I know the effect that even just going through this inquiry and going through this process in Victoria had on me, and you know, the searing memories of and sometimes really sad memories. Now, you've been at this for what, 6 years, and with a whole new podcast. How are you coping?
Mostly okay. I get mentally tired by hearing the same untruths come out in each state. Every now and then emotionally, I will have a bit of a fold. And somebody asked me the other day, do you celebrate when these laws pass? And I say, on one level, but on another level, I feel very sad, because I remember this very strong feeling in the chamber when the law passed in Victoria. I just felt the room was filled with ghosts. I thought of the people I had met, the people whose lives had ended badly, who had suicided, my own father. I now have a very large companionship of ghosts. Also, people who use Victoria's law. And, I interviewed 3 people who each had the medication. And it gives you a sense of, I guess, the urgency of the need, that none of those people were alive 5 weeks later. And they had all, other than one of them, 2 of them, one of them had hoped to live for another 7 years. So, I'm carrying a real companionship of ghosts, and they speak to me at different times, and I'm reminded of them at different times. And sometimes that is a little overwhelming, and I'll go and have a moment.
Yeah, I can imagine. I just yesterday, and I think this fellow will be watching now, but a fellow called Ryan sent me an email to say that his grandmother had died on Thursday, and she'd set the date. And he said as you said, he said it was such a brave thing to do. She was raised as a strong Catholic, but it was also an act of love to enable her family to spend that time with her. And the death was beautiful, as they described, beautiful and peaceful. And it was, while it was a terribly sad moment for them, the fact that she did it like that actually made it easier for them, because they knew she was willing and ready.
Yeah, and it's most people describe it that way, not all. One family I spoke to, who the wife is a doctor and does assess for VAD, but after the family supported the father's choice, but afterwards they were profoundly shocked by it and confronted by it, and wondered if they'd done the right thing, even though they supported the choice. So there's a real dichotomy. It's very different. Perhaps one of the most powerful conversations I've ever had in my life was with one of the people that used the medication, and he was a musician and a very dry sense of humor, and I liked him straight up, and my kind of guy. And 3/4 of the way through the conversation, he was pretty cool, was not the right word, but he was certainly very comfortable with his decision. But it became clear there was something he was very uncomfortable about, and he put it on me. He said, basically, he had one daughter, and she was the light of his life. And he said, I always hear this as a kumbaya kind of a thing, but I think it might be something darker. How am I meant to say goodbye to her? And it was the most heartbreaking conversation, because it's not a golden ticket. You still got to die, and most of us don't want to do that. And you still have to say goodbye to everything you love.
I know. We're going to share the details of the second series of the podcast, Far and Wide. I'm sure it's being listened. Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you just for all the work that you've done. I know that you've made a commitment not to rest until every state and territory has passed this, and I just hope that each time those arguments and those straw men that people put up are knocked down forever, and there's less of them with each debate.
Yeah, look, I hope so. Although there was a piece in the Australian a couple of weeks ago, and you and I have both read so many awful things, but this was the worst. And it was an oncologist and a former AMA president, and they referred to these unverifiable stories of suffering that have duped politicians into making these laws. And I thought, how dare you? How dare you tell any of us that this didn't happen. And also, as you would know well, Fiona, many of the people telling those stories are politicians.
That's right. I know. Yes. One of the least trusted professions in the world. So why we rely on them for this information. Andrew, thanks again, and thank you for all your work. And please send my regards to those ghosts who are with you next time you're speaking to them.
You would know some of them. Thanks so much.
So thank you.
Bye-bye.